Well, welcome. This is the Atlas Speaker Series, and one of several distinguished visitors we have. I will just point out that we have, after today, 3 more talks this semester. If you'd like to know more about the Atlas Speaker Series, which brings a rich diversity of folks working at the intersection of technology and human society, please pick up either one of these. They're the same. And we'll just set them over here out of the way. So I'm John Bennett, Director of Atlas, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. Today's guest is Dr. Andrew Chien. We're really glad to have you. Dr. Chien is the William Eckhardt Professor in Computer Science at the University of Chicago, also a Senior Fellow at the University of Chicago's Computation Institute, and a Senior Computer Scientist at Argonne National Laboratory. Andrew has been active in a variety of different disciplines for a while, not as long as some of us, but he's a longtime leader and active researcher in parallel grid and cloud computing. From 2005 to 2010, he was the Vice President of Research at Intel with global responsibility for long-range and disruptive technologies. He was instrumental in the creation of the Universal Parallel Computing Research Center's focus on parallel software, and the Open Cirrus Consortium, which focused on cloud computing, and Intel's Exascale research program. He has his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees from MIT, but we won't hold that against you. So I just want to end by saying that the speaker series is made possible by a very generous donation by Adit Carol Caperton and Ananta Carol, for whom we are deeply grateful. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Chien.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, great. Thanks, John, for that very kind introduction. I had a slide which actually tell you a little bit about my history, but I'll flip through it kind of quickly because John covered most of it. But like many folks, I started my technical career as a bright young technologist. Well, maybe bright, but a young technologist from MIT, and I started off at the University of Illinois, and I spent years there working in fundamental technologies for computer science, and then got excited by these folks working in applications at NCSA. So they were applying computers to do large-scale scientific simulation. So that was great fun. And then I got interested in sort of this whole idea around entrepreneurship and startups and how technology actually makes its way out into society. So I went off to UC San Diego, in part because there was an opportunity, right, to engage with what was then, right, sort of the explosive growth at the end of the 90s around startups and internet technology and all of those kinds of things, and also put together some centers that actually brought industry right into the academe in a rich and interesting way. Then in 2005, as John mentioned, I got offered what seemed like an unbelievably good job, right, which was to run Intel Research, and the Charter for Disruptive Technologies included outreach and partnership with people in developing regions, governments in those places, ministries of education, and of course doing things in conjunction with those countries, right, to understand how they could help, right, their economic development, and of course Intel's partnership in that. So that was great fun. After 5 years of doing that, it was really a wonderful job, and Intel's a very exciting company. It was a bit too organizational for me. So I had to go back into a job where I could think a little bit more. So I took this very enjoyable position at the University of Chicago in computer science. Here's forgive me, I'm going to show you 2 propaganda slides. This is the new group we started, and we're focused on large-scale systems. With the notion that these large-scale systems are now interfacing to virtually every aspect of society in a pretty rich and interesting way these days, right? Computing has introduced itself, or information technology has introduced itself into virtually every aspect and corner of society. These are, of course, the bright people that do all the work in my group, not me. And we're doing 3 things. One I'm going to talk about today. The first is this idea of 10 by 10. So I'll talk about that, so I won't say much about it right now. But the others are 2 projects looking at fundamental challenges for computing technologies. The first is this Blockus project, and the basic idea is that we seem to want to compute on larger and larger data all the time, but the way that we do it today is very expensive and requires lots of energy and so on, even though a few companies like Google can afford to do that, right? Lots of people can't. So Let's invent some new ways to actually make that possible. And then the second project I'll mention here is called GVR, which is an effort to figure out how we can actually program systems that are highly unreliable. And right now, we don't really have any good ways of doing that in a structured and disciplined fashion. So these are all early stage and growing projects, and if anyone's excited about coming to Chicago, pretty hard to sell that here in such a beautiful day in Boulder. I'd be happy to talk to them about that. Okay, enough about that. What I'm going to try and talk about today is a little bit about what Moore's Law has wrought. What impact has it had on our ability to innovate and innovations that it's created? Then talk about this new era of Moore's Law that we're quickly passing into. I like to call it Moore's Law amended, right? That's an obvious play on the notion that Moore's Law is actually a law, right? Because it's not really a law in a physical sense of a law. And then talk about the new directions that innovation is finding as a result of this amended era. And then talk more generally about this landscape of innovation, right? So that's a lot of bullets. I don't expect you to read them all now, but you'll see them as we come to them. So Moore's Law is a crazy thing, right? Moore's Law is now deeply inculcated in our society as this icon, right, of disruptive change. Gordon Moore, right, brilliant man, we were talking about him earlier, made this graph in 1965. Have you guys seen this graph? How many of you guys have seen this graph before, right? So what's crazy about this graph is 1965, and look at that y-axis. So 2 to the 6th, how many people can calculate 2 to the 6th? 64 devices. So Gordon extrapolated on 4 data points up to 64 to now we're at 2 billion or something like that, right? So he demonstrated that he was, while a physicist, in a deep way a computer scientist, because only computer scientists would extrapolate from 4 data points out to many millions. But anyway, it's kind of breathtaking to just look at this and realize that this has been sort of one of the most extraordinary continuous exponential trends that you could imagine, right? Unbelievable to extrapolate from 64 up to millions, much less billions, which is where we are today. Okay, so we've been on this extraordinary ride, right? So we've been on this extraordinary ride of the increase of computing power, 25 years of microprocessors. We have Dirk here in the audience. He did some of this stuff. But the industry as a whole and the academic endeavor has gone through epochs of microarchitecture that took us from very, very small numbers of transistors up to, in recent days, right, hundreds of millions of transistors in these devices. And these epochs of microarchitectures involve the addition of advanced microarchitecture techniques, pipelining, superscalar, floating point multimedia, and so on, right? I won't go into the details of any of that kind of stuff, right? That's another place, another time. But most interesting is that extraordinary advance of Moore's Law has produced about 1,000-fold performance in that 25-year period. That's pretty extraordinary, right? So whenever my computer architecture friends get really excited about, we did a great job, 1,000-fold performance, I like to remind them that, well, okay, you did a good job, but it was built on technology that was fundamentally 100 times faster, and using a number of transistors that was 50,000 times greater over that spectrum. So you should be proud of yourself, but maybe you had a little help, right? So don't be too proud of yourself. Okay, so this is what Moore's Law has wrought in microprocessors, and that's the way it's often framed. And this is, another plot that shows the same kind of a thing, right? What we've got here is time across the x-axis, and you've got the different microprocessors, all from Gordon's company, right, Intel. If you were to add the points for 2010 or so, the latest chips that were introduced in late 2011, 8 cores, 3.3 gigahertz, 20 megabytes of cache on the chip. That's pretty extraordinary. And something like, I couldn't get an exact number, something like 2.5 billion transistors, right, is the kind of thing we're talking about at the end of this curve. So pretty extraordinary, quite a ride, produced extraordinary progress. So what did we get from that? We got not only really fast microprocessors, we have got computers that went from kilo operations per second to mega operations per second to giga operations per second, right? Several orders of magnitude. We got devices that went from kilobytes to megabytes to gigabytes memories, right? Again, right? 6 orders of magnitude. And we have storage systems that went from megabytes to gigabytes to terabytes, right? Extraordinary amounts of data, right? And I think that's generally appreciated, right, as some of the benefits of Moore's Law. But one of the things that's perhaps less appreciated is that we really got fast communication out of this. So when you hear about 3G cellular networking, or 10 megabits on your DSL, right? Or 250 megabit, 802.11, whatever letter they're using these days, IG, whatever, something like that, right? All of those things are happening because of extraordinary phi layer processing, right, in the wireless channels or in the copper channels, enabled by fantastic amounts of computation, right, all driven by Moore's law, right? So you can't do 200 megabits per second Wi-Fi without doing gigaops of operation in order to do that encoding and decoding. So in a very direct way, fast communication is a product of Moore's law, right? And then finally, of course, we have things that are really small, right, and really cheap. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but we have tiny computers and intelligent things, right? The impact of that has been extraordinary. It's been extraordinary in that computing and information access has disseminated extraordinarily broadly, right, across different economic strata, right? It's not uniform by any means, right? But we now have in many places around the world computing and information access at very, very low levels of economic development, right? Cell phone access and in fact data access, right, is available in many, many, right, quite poor regions, right? It's no longer just an elite thing. It's also been extraordinarily disseminated geographically, right? So we have ubiquitous, truly ubiquitous, right, access to information. This is on a ship somewhere, I think, in the Persian Gulf. This is somewhere in North Africa, I think, and that one's in North Africa, right? But people can have access, right, to information pretty much anywhere, right, on demand, right? So this is all motherhood and apple pie. And the impact of Moore's law has also been, right, extraordinary, right, in its direct impact in society because in an unprecedented way, right, it's produced infrastructures that connect all aspects of the world, right? So people all over the world. So we have, fiber optic networks as well as satellite networks that in their fundamental lower level way support extraordinary connections. This is a picture of people blogging, right, from all over the world, right, and a visualization of the interconnection of the blogging from all over the world. And of course, this is the now well recognized, right, sort of geographic mapping of Facebook, friend connections, right, all over, 6 continents, right, not 7. So at some level, right, one way to think about this is Moore's law has enabled us to go from an electrical world to an electronic world, to an intelligent electronic world, to a networked world, to maybe even things that are disposable, right? And it's extraordinary, right, that we're able to dispose of things that are extraordinarily intelligent and have hundreds, if not thousands, if not millions of transistors in them. And it's everything from, things that you see, right? Electronic intelligent toys that they give away at places like McDonald's with a Happy Meal these days. I mean, that's pretty amazing. To greeting cards, right, that are programmable and sing you different songs and do semi-intelligent kinds of things. Of course, right, extraordinary intelligence in these gigantic, right, megawatt windmills, right, to solar-powered intelligent trash cans, right, that call when they're full or do their own compaction, right? So these are the kinds of things that Moore's law has enabled: intelligent parking meters, street lights, doorknobs, and so on, right? So this list could go on and on and on, but in summary, right, this technology has become extraordinarily small, extraordinarily cheap, and a part of almost everything, right, that we build into our environments these days. Okay, so we're living in a world of Moore's law amended, right, or the waning days of Moore's law is another way to describe it, right, where we've moved into a world in which, due to the physical properties of manufacturing and the challenges in the physics of these devices, that we're no longer able to make the kinds of rapid improvements that we were able to make for the better part of 25 or 30 years. At a technical level, what's going on is that we're getting continued increases in density, which means stuff continues to get cheaper, but we're getting very modest improvements in the fundamental technologies. So things aren't no longer getting as fast as they used to, and power or energy is not going down as fast as it used to. So that means that we have to resort to techniques like parallelism, right? That's why we have multi-core chips. And there's now on the dock, right, on the verge of what's coming, near threshold voltage technologies. I don't expect you to know what that means, but it's a circuit technology that you can think of as trying to squeeze the last couple of turns, right, of the crank out of getting greater energy efficiency out of these systems. Packaging and stacking and new kinds of innovations, right? So to give you a sense of sort of how rough things are, folks are actually turning to what I consider to be actually pretty exciting and promising, but quite challenging, heterogeneity and customization as one of the big opportunities in getting better performance. I'm going to talk a little bit about one set of ideas for how to do that, this idea 10 by 10. Okay. Because of this change in scaling, energy has now become sort of the critical limit, right, for all computation, for all computing systems. And the one way to see that is to look at the biggest systems in the world. This is the Cray Jaguar machine at Oak Ridge National Lab, which in 2010 was the fastest computer in the world. It's not anymore. That system was about 1.75 petaflops and consumed about 10 megawatts. Gigantic amount of energy, right? If you do the computation, it's about 6 nanojoules per flop, right? It's interesting, right? If you calculate the same metric for an iPhone, and some crazy people went and put LinPack on iPhones, right? It's somewhere around a quarter to half a gigaflop, and I didn't update this for the 4S, right? But I could have. The computation actually is remarkably close. It's about 6 to 12 nanojoules per flop for these devices. If you extrapolate forward to where we're going, the folks at the Department of Defense, DARPA, a research organization, did a very, very nice study called the DARPA Exascale hardware study. And they decided that in order to actually make exascale computing practical, the most critical challenge was, as I said at the top of the slide, energy. So they set a very ambitious target, right, which is 10 picojoules per op, right? So that's about 3 orders of magnitude performance, energy improvement, and 10 picojoules per op at the system level, at the chip and the system level, which would allow you to build an exaflop computer at about twice the energy, right, of that petaflop computer, right, in 2010. If it turns out, right, if you take that same metric and you apply it to, let's say, some other kind of intelligent smartphone, maybe someday they're not all from Apple, it seems like they all are right now, of 10 picojoules per op at the chip level and 10 picojoules per op for, well, you don't use it for system interconnect in a smartphone, but you use it for communications and display, right? That's where all the rest of the energy goes. It's a quite reasonable 160 gigaflops. That may sound like a lot of computing, but if you want to do what people are talking about, 3D, augmented reality, immersive, user interfaces kind of stuff, right? This is a perfectly reasonable amount of computation to use those kinds of things, right? So top to bottom, right? Energy is not only the critical limiter today, it continues to be the critical limiter probably for the foreseeable future. Okay. If you're going to get to this target of 20 picojoules per operation, there's really sort of 3 paths forward that are viable. So this is sort of the old era of Moore's law scaling, where we got performance very, very nicely as a function of time. And now we're moving into a regime which is energy limited scaling. And there's 3 basic approaches that are being explored. The first is big core scaling. That is, take the existing designs with some small modification, put a bunch of them together, right, and try to scale up via parallelism. That's pretty much what you buy in the marketplace today. That's what you buy in a laptop. That's what you buy in a desktop. That's what's happening in most of the servers. And that will get you some performance, as I've shown here, but is not that energy efficient, so you ultimately will be limited in this approach. A second, more radical approach is being pursued, which I'll call small core scaling, right? And there's a few folks that are doing this. You could argue that GPUs, right, NVIDIA's chips and so on sort of fall into this category, and the idea is to take that big fat core, make it really, really simple, and then put a real lot of them on a single chip. So the NVIDIA chips today are shipping, depending on how you count, somewhere between 45 and 500 kinds of cores. It depends on what you count as a core, but they're much smaller. And the problem is, right, that if you put your traditional software on them, it probably runs 10 times slower before you add parallelism. So it's a big step back to try to get forward. So that's challenging. The third option I'm going to talk about is this idea of trying to build heterogeneous architectures. And that idea includes hybrid architectures. And so the challenge here really is quite a conundrum for the field and for the industry. We're talking about breaking a 50-year computing paradigm that's worked extraordinarily well and scaled over 6 orders of magnitude, right? And the challenge is, what's the best way to do that? Okay. So we're seeing multicore everywhere, right? This is sort of the ramp you're seeing on servers, and now, of course, you even see multicores in smartphones and tablets, right? The big news at CES this year was quad-core, right, phones and tablets. But the challenge here, right, is that there's actually a huge amount of energy efficiency that can be gotten from heterogeneity, right? So it's not just parallelism, but heterogeneity, right, is the second big opportunity. And this chart actually gives you a little sense of what's possible. This is an energy metric in terms of compute per unit energy. And you can see microprocessors, general purpose microprocessors, are as much as an order of magnitude lower than digital signal processors, which you see often in embedded devices and so on, and perhaps 2 orders of magnitude or even 3 orders of magnitude lower than customized accelerators that you might see for various kinds of video encoding or decoding or encryption or decryption kinds of special purpose hardware. So the motivation here is that there's as much as 2 orders of magnitude potential scaling and improvements if you're able to make a heterogeneous approach work. Okay. So heterogeneity is a little bit radical, but it's worth observing that it's already happening at scale. So if you look at the landscape of computing devices that we think of computing devices, we have servers, desktops, laptops, and tablets probably are in the same class, and then smartphones as smaller devices. The spectrum's already pretty significant. So we have homogeneous devices on the top in the servers. We have some heterogeneity already in the desktops and the laptops. Almost all of the chips being shipped today have some combination of CPU and graphics, right, on a single chip, right? And then the smartphones and some of the tablets already have extreme heterogeneity, somewhere between 6 or 8, or maybe even as many as 10 different accelerators incorporated. So this is what the picture looks today. These squares, right, are intended to be roughly 100 million units, right, in the marketplace. And I think the baseline here was 2010. You can see laptops and tablets and smartphones are already the dominant share. If you go to the IDC and you ask them what the world looks like in 2015, what they'll tell you is smartphones become 4 times larger than they are today. Laptops and tablets, this is probably mostly growth in tablets, grow by 500 million units a year. And you see hardly any movement at all, right, in volumes here. So the argument here is, in fact, most of computing will be heterogeneous by 2015, right? Okay. So if you're a software person, you're thinking, oh crap, what does this mean, right? Because heterogeneity is a pain, right? Another way of looking at this is, well, today, everyone's doing heterogeneity, right? NVIDIA shipping Tegra 2 parts, and Tegra 3 parts. Apple has this nice A5, or there's a new version, I guess, introduced last week. TI has a nice line of OMAP processors. What's sort of wrong with these chips, right? They're already heterogeneous. What are you talking about, Andrew? And the answer is they're 90% not programmable, right? So if we believe in this kind of more general purpose kind of programming paradigm, we have to find a way to make these things more programmable. Okay, let me just talk through this quickly. I can see I'm falling a little bit behind here. So this is, one way to think about what you'd like to do. This is the landscape of computing, right? So on the right side, on the x-axis, you have more programmable systems here. On the y-axis, you have energy efficiency. So up is good. And in a perfect world, you'd have things that are highly programmable and highly energy efficient. You'd be up there, right? Traditional processors or multi-core chips are sort of highly programmable, but not that energy efficient. We're adding parallelism to them, so they're sort of moving back this way. They're becoming less programmable because parallelism is not that easy, right? But they're becoming slightly more energy efficient. GPUs, right, more energy efficient than traditional CPUs, are adding features to make them more general purpose, so they're becoming slightly less energy efficient. SoCs are adding GPUs and multi-core processors, so they're becoming slightly more programmable, but less energy efficient. And up there you have hardwired kinds of ASICs. There's an opportunity to build something different, right? And this is what we call 10 by 10, which hopefully would preserve some of the benefits of these more customized chips, but be much more programmable. So I'll just talk about that idea for a few minutes and go on to the rest of the talk. Let's see. So the idea here is that the traditional organization for compute processors is based on this notion that you have a general purpose core. And the idea behind an aggressive approach to heterogeneity is that you fundamentally have to have a bunch of special purpose cores talking to some kind of shared data structure. So there's a big opportunity, right, because nobody knows how to do this heterogeneity in a general purpose way, to define an architecture for computing systems of the future built on heterogeneity. The biggest challenge, of course, is how you could program such a thing, and how do we architect for this systematically, right? Okay, so that's one of the things that we're exploring as one of the most exciting opportunities in dealing with this change at the end of Moore's law. Let me just skip forward here. So we've had this extraordinary benefit, right? Extraordinary advance of Moore's law and extraordinary progress, right? We've made room-sized computers, right, literally become this big, right? And we deliver that computing capability for pennies where it used to cost tens of millions of dollars. But it's worth observing, as much as I love technology, right? And I came most recently from a company that definitely loves technology, that, well, how important is technology these days? So let me ask the question, right? How do we choose the devices that we use today? So what's your computer of choice, right? So this is a big honking gaming engine, right? Gaming PC, super cooled, overclocked at 5.5 gigahertz and so on. How many people this is their machine of choice? Okay, you got one. We got one hardcore gamer. Okay, this is a garden variety kind of, a laptop, right? So think of this as like an i5, right, or something like that, probably 3.5 pounds or something like that. For how many people is this their machine of choice? Okay, a few more, right? Okay, this is my machine of choice, but this is the computer I have. I have an 11-inch MacBook Air, thin, light, instant on. How many people this is their machine of choice? Okay, so my point here is just that you didn't pick the most powerful one from a computational point of view, right? There are other factors. How about your smartphone of choice? Okay, old picture, iPhone 4S over here. We'll start with the popular ones. How many people that's their smartphone of choice? Okay, maybe half. This is the quad-core Huawei phone that was just introduced. I think it's called the D or something like that, right? Fast as possible, giant screen, all that kind of stuff. How many people are going to rush out and buy that? Okay. This is a little bit less risky. This is the HTC One, right, which is also a quad-core phone. HTC, well-known. How many people are going to rush out and buy that? It's a quad-core phone. Okay, a few people. Okay. So probably lots of people would prefer to buy or have the iPhone, not only because they're accustomed to it, but because there's a lot of other externalities, right, that make this a valuable device to have, whether it be software, applications, interoperation with their desktop, services, whatever, right? So again, technology is not necessarily the primary driver for this kind of choice. Okay, one more that's even more extreme. Oh, how did that happen? This is supposed to be an iPad. I don't know why it's black and without silver. I must have cut off the silver edge when I was cropping the pictures. Sorry about that. Right, so we have tablets, right? And tablets are probably the most extreme example of this, right? So Apple just introduced, or just upgraded their iPad. I don't remember what it's called. It's called iPad 2 still, I think, right? Or iPad. Just iPad. Okay, see, you guys not only know the technology, you know the marketing. That's really scary. Okay, and then these are some quad-core, right, Tegra 3 tablets. I think this one's from Asus. Oh, that's probably a slightly older Motorola, right, tablet. But, if you look at what people are doing, actually, most of them are buying these devices, right? Again, because of this sort of ecosystem as well as, interactive experience and so on. So the point of this is that, on the backs of, 6 orders of magnitude improvement of Moore's law, and even in the face of these challenges, that you could argue that we're in the domain of technology overshoot, right? That the technology that we have in most cases actually is good enough to do most of what we would need to do. Now, I don't mean in all aspects, right? but I mean in aspects of traditional metrics of technology, right? Computing power, communication, storage, those kinds of things, right? So that the choices that we make as to which devices we choose to spend our hard-earned money on or that are most useful, right, are based on other factors besides technology factors, right? So we started into this with Moore's Law, right? Moore's Law is converting into some challenges, but maybe we're already in a situation of technology overshoot. So what matters? You want to volunteer some ideas? What matters to you, Dirk?
I was going to say it's perhaps not so much technology overshoot as also the prices have dropped sufficiently that you can actually now make choices of what you have when. So Nicholas here has an iPad, but you also have a smartphone sometimes. Right, and so if you wanted to look at something on a larger screen where it was more responsive, you might have the two different devices at the same time, because now the cost of that is relatively marginal.
Okay.
Compared to what a laptop was 2
So,
years ago.
so it's not a unitary choice. You can choose multiple options.
Right.
Okay, good. What else matters? Anyone going to admit fashion?
Yeah.
They want to be seen with the coolest devices? Come on. Weight? Does weight matter? Good.
I think computing still matters would be just solid theory, which is just possible now to be able to do speech recognition on the
Right.
phone. And I want to see more of this, smarter devices.
Okay, so a better interface matters. I'm sorry, I have to keep the computer scientists, the technologists down because they all want to say technology. Yeah.
Can say user-friendliness.
User friendliness, so that means like easier to use, easier to learn. Okay, very good. Yep.
Perhaps a more niche sort of audience for customizability is the ability to program, my Android phone whenever I feel like free, as opposed to having to pay money to develop my iPad.
So openness,
Openness.
customizability, right? That matters. Yeah. Go ahead, Dirk.
I'm gonna channel a waitress from Anchorage, Alaska in the year 2000, where there was a computer architecture conference as a chair. I was at a table with a bunch of people from Digital Equipment Corporation and Intel. And when asked what was her deciding factor, it was the speakers.
There you go.
So the entertainment.
Sound quality, right? Entertainment, absolutely. Anyone else? Weight, heat, color. All right. Battery life, interoperation matters, services, right? Okay. So all kinds of other things matter, right? And I think you could have a healthy argument about technology overshoot and to what degree. I think it would be too strong a claim to say technology doesn't matter, right? That's too strong a claim. But certainly we're in a world in which now many other things also matter, right? Okay. So where are we now in terms of size, cost and capability? And what I mean by that is what part of these systems, right? Because you don't go out and buy a single small microprocessor chip, right? You go out and buy an iPad, right? Or an Asus transformer, right? Try to give vendors equal time, right? Or a Lenovo ThinkPad or whatever, right? So what determines size? It's not the electronics anymore in general, right? It might be the display, right? Certainly the first order determinant of weight in mobile devices seems to be batteries these days, right? Or, for some of these really, really small devices, right, antennas are a problem. Particularly if the spectrum, right, that you're able to use isn't a particularly shortwave spectrum, right? And you don't always get to choose, right? Okay. Keyboards, right? It's a first approximation, right? I mean, laptops are sort of determined by keyboards. I don't know, right? Lots of people are adding keyboards to their iPads, so you got to carry those things around. So these input devices are actually a critical thing. What about cost? Are electronics a first order contributor to cost in these devices? Well, it sort of depends, right? You can sort of size that, right? Because now you can buy a 16 gig, a 32 gig, a 64 gig, whatever device. But for lots of these devices, right, certainly the processing part of the silicon BOM is tiny, right? The silicon bill of materials, right? The actual cost of the silicon going into that device. If you include a collection of silicon, right? So not just the processor, but also maybe the radio, maybe some flash memory or some of those other kinds of things, it's a larger fraction. But it's still not the dominant fraction, right? We're in a world in which the display cost is often quite comparable to the silicon cost, right? The machining around the case and this beautiful machined aluminum stuff that you get, right? Well, it may not be more than silicon bomb, but it's comparable to the silicon bomb, and so on, right? So as a contributor to cost, right, it's not clear the electronics is the most significant thing. And then, of course, if you ask the question, what's contributing to the capability, that's what we were just talking about, right? A lot of it's in the software, right? A lot of it's in the design of these devices. And then, of course, various kinds of services that are attached to them, right? The hardware device itself is only one piece of that puzzle. So how small can these things be today? I mean, here's an example, right? There's these crazy guys that built a cell phone, and this is the thumb, right? So I kept the thumb to give you a sense of scale, right? So basically, you can build a cell phone the size of a thumb today, right? It actually functions. There's aspects of flexibility, right, and other kinds of things we think of as being traditional, but are actually on the verge of changing very rapidly. This is an illustration of you could build actually flexible devices, right? This is a flexible AMOLED technology that Samsung has produced, and you can actually build devices that fold and curve and all kinds of things like that. And the silicon can be made compliant with that. So really, you're talking about just a few remaining factors required that are preventing us from having sort of radically different form factors for devices, right? Okay. So we've got all this capability, and I'm making the case that maybe even though Moore's law is slowing down, right, that electronics aren't necessarily the ultimate gate, right, on our ability actually to continue to innovate in these spaces. What else is going on, right, that is exciting, right, in innovation around computing, right? It's not just about computing power. So we're seeing extraordinary growth, right, in what I will call richness of interaction, and I'll talk about 2 dimensions of that, right? So the first thing is, right, is that this richness of interaction is happening in large scale. So I'll start with large scale and then go to small scale, things like Siri and so on, right? So what's the large scale? The large scale is connecting the internet and the physical world, right? And that richness of interaction you can think of as the eyes and ears of the cloud, right? So in every vaguely terrifying science fiction book you've ever read, right, about some computer that takes over the world, right, it's omnipresent and aware of everything that's going on, right? That's actually happening now, right? In a way that never happened before, qualitatively different, right? Okay, what are some examples of that? Well, we have ubiquitous sensing, right? Everyone's seen racks of these cameras, right? They're all going straight back to some headquarters where, at least theoretically they could be recorded, though in practice they're often not. You've got live traffic feed and tracking, right? So this is, a map of where I live today, Chicago, traffic and buses and all kinds of things. Again, something that you wouldn't think was possible 30 years ago, right? It wasn't possible 30 years ago, but now it's just accepted as, of course, right? Of course people know where cars are. Of course people know where specific taxis are. Of course people know where your smartphone is, right? Because they know, right? That's all streaming right up to the cloud, okay? This is give you a sense of the density of the infrastructure. This is a plot of cell phone towers in the Bay Area, right? And you can't see, right, individual dots, right, if you know the Bay Area, right? So here's the Bay, here's San Francisco, here's Oakland, and so on. It's so dense, right, that it basically fills in on a map of this scale, right? So the infrastructure is extraordinarily dense, right, around this kind of sensing, right? So I wanted to contrast that to things you think of as being just once in a while to things that are really sort of, broad coverage kinds of infrastructures, right? And of course, people are doing things in less populated areas. This is a wireless mesh network connecting, wave buoys in Queensland. Anyone know why they have wave buoys in Queensland? It's not for tsunamis. Go ahead. It's not for tsunamis. It's for surfers. This is so people can know when there's good surf and they can get out there, right? So it's for recreation and entertainment. So I did that because you might think of that as a frivolous use, right? Some people would say not frivolous, but this shows the extent to which this kind of infrastructure has become sort of widely deployed and pervasive, right? Okay. Okay. So now we have, right, this widely distributed sensing, right? So we have this so-called Internet of Things, right? We move from a world in which you had electric to electronics to intelligent, to electronic, intelligent, networked, right? That's a big change. So we have automobiles feeding the cloud. We have parking meters feeding the cloud, right? Parking meters feeding the cloud. Oh my gosh, they know when someone parks there and when someone doesn't. I forgot to put bicycles up here, right? Does anyone know there's a bunch of places that they have essentially these bicycle loaning programs that where effectively the bicycles are signaling where they are? I mentioned the trash cans earlier, night lights, right? Various kinds of activated, motion sensing kinds of lights. And then, of course, all the mundane stuff, right? Music players, watches, eyeglasses. We don't even think anything of this stuff, right? Feeding the cloud. Clothing, right? All streaming data to the cloud, right? That's the world of rich cyber-physical interaction that we're in. And if anything, we're accelerating, right? Doesn't seem to be any slowing. Okay. Of course, right? Cloud eye view of what's going on means that you can see extraordinary things, right? So Google did this very, very cool project. It's still up there. Like Flu Trends is still going on, where they just looked at search streams, right, from different parts of the world, and they said, can we tell where there's flu activity in the world, right? So this is sort of an object case study of, and it turns out looking at these search logs and streams is highly predictive of where, subsequent equivalents of CDC reports, right, would track, except they're faster, right? They're able to predict it several days before these disease control centers are actually able to track it. So this tells you how powerful this is, right? Amazing, the integration and monitoring, right, of these information flows allows you to have an extraordinary perspective. So cloud companies can do this. Folks who have access to the kind of distributed infrastructure and aggregate information can infer extraordinary things, right? Now, I'm not trying to scare you, right? There's many, many trivial things that they're not inferring. It's really hard to do this in sort of the really scary and sort of conspiratorial way that people tend to think of it. But the potential is there to do this at extraordinary scale and for extraordinary things. And to give you a sign of sort of how far we are along in this thinking, I think we now take almost as a given, right, the notion. So this is a classical picture of, a command center for a special ops kind of a mission, right, like secret forces like to run. And what these guys do, whether it be for a military mission or for another kind of mission, is they aggregate information from satellites, low-level monitoring devices, ground networks, individuals, and so on. And the interesting thing about this is they know what's going on better than the people that are there. Does that surprise anyone here? No, of course not. They have a better perspective, right? So this tells you, right, that in fact, remote support and information integration and sort of the ability to create a synthetic point of view is much better, right, than on the ground these days. That's the point we've gotten to. That tells you how good and how pervasive in some cases and so on the sensing can be, right? So that's extraordinary, right? Okay, so that's one richness of interaction. That's between the cyber infrastructure and the physical world, right? The second one is, of course, what we like to think about, right? This is for us, right? So this is sensing and interaction, and this is the human interface, right? So this is my computer and me, right? Come on, smile. My computer and me. When the computer says to you, my human and me, then you'll know you should be worried. Okay. So, of course, right, what's exciting in this space? Well, we're just bursting into this world of an old idea becoming a practical reality. So augmented reality, right? So today you can pick up your tablet, pick up your smartphone, and do interactive augmentation, right? People can paint information on things and so on, right? You can have safety information, you can have a richer experience, right? And if you have slightly better display technology, right, this is what it might look like in a heads-up display in an automobile, right? I think this is maybe from Mercedes-Benz or something like that. You can imagine information annotation in a way that's much less intrusive than holding up a smartphone, right? So this says your following distance for this truck is 1.8 seconds. That it might actually be a useful bit of information. Right, so there's those kinds of things going on. And then, of course, right, there's this explosion of interest around direct manipulation, right? So this is the famous Tom Cruise scene from Minority Report, where he has this, what seemed at the time, right, to be this unbelievably cool display, right? He reached up and he pulled information and he twisted it around and so on. And now, if you had a startup that did this, I don't even think you could get VCs excited anymore. They say, well, okay, that's hard, that's hard, that's hard. But the notion that you could do it, I think, is no longer in question, right? Okay. And we're just about to take another leap, right? those of you who've been following this closely, bear with me for a minute. But there's a company called PrimeSense, right, that has introduced essentially 3D sensors, right? So back in the olden days, you had to pay $10,000 for a LiDAR sensor or a big spinning mirror, and it painted an image, right, with a laser beam, and it caught the reflections back, and it would sweep over a space, much like old television sets, right, sort of rastering across the space. More recently, right, with the Xbox 360, they added a device called Kinect, right? So this Kinect device actually does a simultaneous, right, sort of a 2D depth map, right, of a space, right? Now that system was very successful and sparked a whole range of research, right? Worked well in a gaming kind of setting where you stand kind of 2 meters from the device and you dance around and you play your games and so on, right? Okay, very good. Recently, right, there was a new product introduced which is based on the same sensor technology, which creates these 3D point clouds or depth maps, right? But it does it much closer, all the way into about 1/2 meter, right? So why does that matter? That matters because for most of our close-in interaction with devices, we're actually much closer than 2 meters, right? So you need to be in that close, right? And what they're learning from this, right, is that you can take such a sensor, and Microsoft Research built a very interesting system that they let out in the wild last summer, right? And you can actually get software, I think, to play with this now, where you could, so here's the actual picture, right? So this is just an image of a scene. These are various kinds of 3D reconstructions, actually, of what's going on in the scene. So they're able to just take this scanner and wave it around, right? Moves around, and dynamically construct, right, a 3D model on the fly of what's going on in the world around them, right? So this is dramatically better than what was possible with computer vision techniques before. And they've been able to demonstrate in real time doing some pretty extraordinary things, right? So here's an example of where they've applied the system to a person holding various physical artifacts, right? And then interacting with those physical artifacts, right? So they're not only able to localize, right, where the sheet is, right, and the human is and holding it, they're able to, in real time, paint on top of that, right? This is a bunch of sort of balls and devices that you might throw into simulation. Think of them as little foam balls, right? They're being added into this, and then they're doing 3D physical simulation, right, like you do in fancy computer graphics in movies, right? So that these balls can interact in real time with the shaking of this sheet, which is a pretty complicated thing, right? All that in real time, right? So we're very fast moving into a world, right? It'll take a little while before this shows up on your smartphone, but we're very fast moving into a world in which the connection, right, between that 3D physical space and relationship of physical objects will be internalized in real time by the computing system and therefore can be augmented, right? And that, of course, can be taken several steps further, right? So there was a great article just in Economist last month, so this isn't all me, right? But I'll leave this link and encourage you guys to go read that. But there's a reference to some bright researchers at CMU that are looking at what would happen if you actually had Kinects sort of pervasively deployed, so you could keep track of the physical world in fairly precise spacing. So imagine this is your living room, and you've got your tablets and your smartphone devices, right? This is my favorite smartphone device. This is a Motorola Razr. Very cool. And, right, you add to that space a bunch of these Kinect or PrimeSense, kinds of devices. You can actually, your computing system can be aware of where every object is in the space and give you that kind of, right, sort of deep coupling, right, between the physical space and the physical world. So all of this is possible today, right? Maybe this is today plus 12 months, right? But everything else I've described is possible today. That's pretty extraordinary, right? And that's what we've gotten out of this 6 orders of magnitude improvement from Moore's law. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the changing landscape of innovation, right? So Moore's law has driven this extraordinary change and innovation and created this huge wellspring of IT technology that allows us to do all these extraordinary things. Let's talk about those landscapes. So globally, right, we have an innovation community that's larger than ever before, right? And I don't know quite how to capture that. So here's an attempt, right? So here's just a measure of mobile phone subscriptions, right? Across different parts of a few parts of the world, right? So India and China as large changes, right, in this short period of time. But if you thought of the world as innovators, right, primarily in the United States and maybe Western Europe, right, for a period maybe starting in 1980 or 1990 or something like that, there's really not much question, right, that the innovation community is now several multiples larger, right? In terms of folks that are connected to the flow of ideas, the flow of different new practices, and so on that are going on today. So that's one way to characterize this. Another way to characterize this is a set of maps that I found that characterize a density of sort of cell phone users in a 2001, 2004, 2008 kind of time frame. And the dark colors represent, sort of dense penetration. So this was 2001, and just watch as this changes, right? In the period from 2001 to 2004, and then in the period from 2004 to 2008. Oops. If it'll move, there we go, right? So we're basically in a world in which, if that's a measure, right, of participation in an innovation ecosystem, that it is now including most parts of the world, right, in some degree. Another way to look at this, right, is to look at the networks, the innovation or supplier networks for some of these, global companies, right? This one is just taken from HP. HP is one of the largest, right, probably the largest computer manufacturer in the world today. And this was their global supplier network in 2011. The colors don't matter so much for us. This is about audits versus not auditing. But basically all of the things that are not gray represent large-scale participants, right, in their technology network, right? And you can see it's extraordinarily dispersed across the world, right? Extraordinarily dispersed. So we've got this growing frontier of innovation as well. So it's not just more people, right, in more parts of the world. We've actually evolved through a series of sort of stages of innovation. And that doesn't mean that the innovation in the core areas doesn't continue. It means that actually there may be more action in some sense in these other areas. So, back in the earliest days of the semiconductor industry, there was a focus on how do you build a reliable transistor? And then if it's reliable, how do you actually integrate it, right? That's what Gordon Moore's law was about. It was about integrated devices, right? And then how do you build memory cells and microprocessors and that kind of fundamental stuff, right? And that stuff still matters, because where labor cost is lower. There's various ways to get there. But this lowering of the bar unlocks an explosion of innovation, right? So it's not a bad thing. It allows many, many more things to see the light of day. And you can build many things that were not worth building before, right? So that's not a criticism of those innovations. They're less profound. Of course they are. The path to utility is much shorter and much lower cost, right? So now you can do all these things, and that's why there's whatever 500,000 apps or whatever it is in the App Store, right? And there will be probably 5 million such things at some point, right? Okay. So I promised to say something about how that innovation landscape has changed, and then I'll wrap up because we're about out of time. So who are the big players in the innovation landscape these days? Well, universities, right? We're here at a fine university. And universities actually benefit from this very, very rich and diverse ecosystem of innovation, right? So universities have huge advantages. Number one advantage, open. People flow in, people flow out, ideas flow in, ideas flow out, right? Extraordinary. So rapid information flow and mixing in this environment, right? And I mean that as a contrast to the other parties, right? You have diverse skills and perspectives in universities. And forgive me, I'm a professor, but I don't mean the faculty. I mean that you have an extraordinary mixing amongst the students, whether it be at the undergraduate level, the graduate level, people coming back in for a master's degree, people visiting, people giving seminars, and so on. Extraordinary mixing. And some degree of persistence, right? I don't mean necessarily that the university identifies a strategic priority and sticks with it for 10 years. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that actually, because universities are relatively loosely operated, right? They're not so good at exterminating stray projects, right? So in fact, things can persist for quite a long time, sometimes when they need to be incubated, right? And that's a reality. Okay, so these are some of the strengths of universities. Not all of them, right? Startups. Startups are flexible. They're fast moving and acting, right? And they can draw on diverse skills. They don't necessarily have to have diverse skills, but they can suck people in, right? They tap what's there, right? And perspectives. But their big weaknesses are they have limited reach and persistence, right? If you're in a startup, you're constantly worried about how do we get enough manpower to do that? How do we be present in that way, and so on. And of course, you're always running on a fuse, right? Which is how much money you have or how much time you can work unpaid or whatever, right? So you can't stay at something for 10 years and not see any return, right? What about multinationals? I spent a lot of time in a multinational trying to create innovation and new businesses and so on. And I think that some of the critical problems for multinationals are, believe it or not, compared to universities, they have a very limited ability to take in information. Right? Most parts of most corporations are quite internally focused, and they're quite focused around existing businesses and customers. That limits their bandwidth, right, to actually internalize and understand new things, right? So they have a limited ability to take in information and new perspectives. They have tremendous reach, right? These big multinationals, when they decide to do something, it's everywhere, right? They're able to do things at a scale that is very, very different, right, from what a university could easily do, or certainly what a startup could easily do. In some cases, they have tremendous resources, right? I mean, the budgets look fantastically large sometimes, right? I mean, look at how much money Apple has, look how much. But the reality is, I think, that only a few of the multinationals really have large, sort of flexible pools of resources. A lot of multinationals are just barely scraping by, right? That's the reality. And when people talk about, just as an aside, when people talk about being scared of all of these growing companies in China, one of the interesting things to do is to look at R&D investment in those companies in China. And very few of them are able to scrape out enough profit to do much significant R&D investment. So it's very, very important to realize, even though it may seem like they have lots of resources, in many cases they're quite strapped. But a few do, right? I mean, the Googles, Apples, Intels of the world, Microsofts of the world. And then I would say the biggest challenge that multinationals have is limited persistence, right? And that's because increasingly in this modern, public corporation managed world, and I'll draw that distinction, the ability to invest quarter after quarter, year after year in areas that are on the come, to be developed, to be successful, is very, very limited, I think, in most corporations. So for some of these things, in fact, you might be better off in a different location. So I would say, if you look at how the world has changed over 2 decades or 3 decades of Moore's Law, and the business organizations that have changed, that we've seen a dramatic swing, right, to universities and startups as preferred places for lots of this innovation to happen, as a primary source for this innovation to happen. And I think that you guys should be energized, right, about the ability to drive change in small teams with great ideas, right, and vision and passion and the like, right? So I think that's the innovation landscape. I've got just 2 more slides. I wanted to end on kind of a light note. The first is that we all are sort of aware that there's this increasing pace of global innovation, right? Everyone thinks the world's going faster today. Why is the world going faster? Well, more innovations are happening all the time, and those innovations are coming to market faster and faster and faster. Why is that, right? Well, of course, I could have put a picture of, Vince Cerf or, Tom Friedman, right? Rapid dissemination of information, broad and rapid collaboration of the right expertise, right? Now you can find the right expert in almost nanoseconds, right? Used to be it would take forever to find the right people. In general, there's broadly higher levels of education, right? People are quite a bit more sophisticated, and the number of people educated in any area in the world, right? I mean, so any technical area, almost any part of the world, is dramatically higher than it was 20 or 30 years ago, right? And there's just lots more people, right? And I'll leave on this right now. So a couple of years ago, the biologists discovered that the rate of human evolution is accelerating. It's dramatically higher than it used to be. Anyone heard this? It's pretty amazing. So they've determined, right, by looking at DNA change and the number of SNPs, right, that are being created, that it's something like 100 times faster than it was 5,000 years ago. Wow. Why is it? And then they went back and they looked at their statistics and they looked at their numbers. And there's a very nice article in Discover in December of 2009, which says the primary reason for this is that there are 7 billion people today, right? So the rate of experiments, the rate of mutation that's happening, of course, is proportional to the number of entities or humans, right, participating in this evolution. So of course, numbers are the biggest factor. Okay, with that, we've been through an extraordinary change with Moore's law. It's been spectacular, and a lot of people are worried about what comes next. So there are hard technical challenges, hard technological challenges to keep Moore's law advancing at the rate that it has. And perhaps at some point it will stop. But I think even if it does, right, the innovation frontier is really already very broad for IT and growing rapidly, right? Moore's law goes on for another 6 or 8 years. It will be so intertwined and broad and deep with every aspect of society, I think we can look forward to several more decades of extraordinary innovation around IT technologies. The pace is extraordinarily faster than it was 40 years ago, and it appears to be accelerating. So as Moore's law ends, I think we continue to see a rapid pace of innovation going forward. Thanks for being patient. Appreciate your attention. John, you can tell me if we have time for questions.
Why don't we take a couple of
Okay.
take it off.
Yes, go ahead.
Do you see anything happening with control or quantum computing, any other basic computing technologies?
Oh gosh, well, lots of exciting things. You mean as a replacement, or?
Yeah, or supplement new technologies coming in with.
Boy, you know, one of the depressing parts of my job at Intel was to sit in on all of these roadmap research explorations where the quest was to find a replacement for these CMOS switches, right, that have served us extraordinarily well over several decades. And while there were a few things that may produce a short run, right, of continued improvement, there was no magic bullet, right? So I did never see anything that had any kind of a longevity of promise, right, in the electronic space. I think, you know, there's extraordinarily exciting advances in optics for communication. And you may have seen IBM just demonstrated like a terabit per second on-off chip kind of bandwidth with integrated photonics, and people are doing nanophotonics and so on for on chips. I think the opportunity there to reduce energy and increase communication capability is tremendous. But in no way, I think, do I see that as a replacement. Quantum looks like a different beast completely, right? Exotic and useful in some areas. You know, there's folks doing DNA computing, exotic and perhaps useful in some areas. A few people are shaking their heads. I like to be an optimist about new technologies. I think it still has yet to be proved. But I think none of those things look like replacements. Yeah. Yes?
You left out in your list of innovators,
Yes.
government.
Ah.
And I find that very curious because between the end of the Korean War and the down phasing of the Cold War, most of the innovations in the United States in materials, microelectronics, a host of other things, were the product of government sponsorship.
Oh, so you don't mean government as the innovator, you mean government investment as the driver or supporter for innovator.
Well, government as the innovator, if you want to include DARPA.
Oh, but DARPA doesn't have in-house shops, right? So that would be funding, right?
It outsources.
Yeah. So, that's a good observation. I guess so first, there's no question that there was a period in which the government sponsorship was sort of the primary driver behind a number of these things. You could quibble about, you know, where AT&T Labs, Bell Labs fits in that mix, right? That's a pretty substantial investment as well. And there were several other large of those kinds of things. But I think the government has a huge role to play in supporting, right, broadly innovation and investing in both, you know, legal and policy structures that support it, as well as, you know, fundamental technology and, as you've heard me say, application kinds of research, right, to support that. I'm not a big, you know, fan for government being able to make good choices, right, in and of itself in some of those areas. So I think that's an area where there's, you know, maybe some question as to how to do it. But I mean, you know, one of the things that I had the great pleasure of working with Craig Barrett at Intel, you know, really extraordinary man and passionate about the very topic we're talking about. And we were on a flight one day and we were bemoaning the fact that we were trying to convince the US government to put a few $1 billion more into the NSF. And the same day, the Senate had passed a $700 billion farm subsidy bill. So to calibrate, right, guys, the NSF is $5 or $6 billion a year, maybe up to $7 now. $700 billion farm subsidy bill. Well, you don't have to make the farm subsidy bill go away, but slip a couple billion more over here, guys, right? I mean, that kind of thing I think is very important. Yep. Yep. Over here? Yep.
In your global experiences, you said you had a lot of it at Intel. Were you able to detect sort of common mistakes that technological startups make on emerging countries, or why is it that you don't have more of that happening? Because they have much cheaper labor costs, they don't pay as much to scientists, but yet they don't seem to be able to innovate as much as, I mean, not even comparable to Silicon Valley, for example.
Well, do you mean innovate, or do you mean capitalize on innovation and make money, right? I mean, so for example, one of the things that was interesting is that the U.S. is still the envy of the world, right? In innovation, and particularly capitalization on innovation. And so, for example, some in the U.S. would look at Europe and say, well, Europe is actually doing a better job of investing in some of these areas to support fundamental technology development. But if you go and talk to the folks in the European Commission, they'll tell you they're apoplectic, right? Because there's a whole bunch of new businesses that have been created that are Fortune 50 class businesses, and they're all American companies. So there is no Google in Europe, right? Or equivalent. There's no Amazon, right? There's no Facebook, right? So, and while they have great companies, they would argue actually that many of those, so where are the great companies that have been created in the last 25 years? And much of that has happened in the US. So now it's also happening in Asia now, to be sure. But I think that the US is still a remarkably fertile place, not only for primary innovation, but the translation of that innovation into a vision and strategy that allows you to scale up to extremely large, efficient companies, right?
So why could a country like Mexico, for example, not take a few of those key secret ingredients and just form a little Silicon Valley? Because there's a lot of investment that's just looking for these type of opportunities, but they just never really materialize.
So I won't comment on Mexico because I'm too ignorant to say something meaningful. But I can tell you what the EC folks concluded when they did this analysis. So they concluded it was mostly environmental and regulatory, right? Where the nature of their markets were such that people who innovated, right, were encouraged to create a business model that was highly tuned to a German market or to a French market or what have you. And then by the time they got to a size where they needed to go global, they were incompatible or incapable of changing their culture to stretch and scale in that way. So the argument was, right, that the regulatory environment and the relative homogeneity of the US was a much better incubator for some of these kinds of things to happen. So interestingly, it's not about primary innovation in those guys' view, it's about that midlife scale, right? Sort of post $500 million or something like that when you're trying to go to 20 that they were worried about. Okay, thank you very much.